Force velocity profiling for sprint training. How to and best practices to make this one of the most simple but also effective assessment tools, individualization tools, and things like that for your athletes to take your training to the next level. Let's get into it. So a force velocity profile is exactly what it sounds. You are profiling, assessing how much force an athlete makes at all velocities. And this is evaluated during sprinting as fast as possible. That is the task, right? 30 yards, which we'll get to, sprint as fast as you can. So you have low velocity, which is at the beginning of the sprint. You see how much force they make. You have high velocity, which is lower force at the end of the sprint. And then you have how they connect and kind of put it all together. So that's simply just what the actual task and profile is. And when you do a force velocity profile, on the left, you have the actual sprint that they ran. The solid yellow line is the smooth line of the actual run. The dashed line is the profile. So kind of doing the math into kind of smoothing it out even more. And then on the right is the actual profile itself, right? So again, force, velocity, those are the two axes on the graph, right? We have force on the y, and then we have speed or velocity on the x. The straight line, because it has a linear relationship, the straight line is the force velocity profile, and then the curved line is the power velocity profile, because power has a parabolic relationship. And this is screenshotted directly from the man himself, J.B. Marin, who is one of the original researchers in force velocity profiling. So we have speed here, right? And then we can calculate acceleration, how much that speed is changing. Well, if we know how heavy the athlete is and their acceleration, well, then we can calculate their force, right? Force is mass times acceleration. And then also we can get kind of power in there as well. So that's at different points in the sprint, kind of where all of these metrics are coming from. And the point of force velocity profiling, why you would do this, is you quantify how an athlete sprints, right? So simply just looking at an athlete's time, right? Let's say a 30-yard dash. Well, that's just straight up what they did. But two athletes can run the same 30-yard dash, but do so in two completely different ways, right? What is the strategy for executing the task of sprinting as fast as possible, right? How much force do you make when executing that task? So this can then be kind of categorized or bucketed down into kind of strengths and weaknesses. And common applications of force velocity profiling is putting athletes in a force deficient bucket, right? Your velocity metrics are good, but your force metrics aren't kind of where they should be, relatively speaking. Or on the flip side of that, hey, you're really good at the beginning of the sprint, you create a lot of force, so let's try to make you a little bit more well-rounded, right? Let's complement your force by increasing some of your velocity capabilities. And next we have the actual spitouts of the force velocity profile itself. And this looks like a lot, but let's dive into kind of the 5 most popular, most common metrics, and this will simplify this a little bit more. So we have RF max, which is the max ratio of force, or basically in the first step, how much of their total force is actually going horizontal. Higher would be better. Next is F0, so it's going to be the theoretical max force. So of the force velocity profile line, when velocity is 0, how much force are they making? And then on the flip side, we have V0, so that is their theoretical max velocity, right? With the line, when force is 0, what is the highest velocity that they can achieve? DRF is the decrease ratio of force, or more or less kind of how do they rise, or how does their kind of force change as they go throughout a sprint. And last, one of the more common ones is tau, or it's kind of just an acceleration derivative, and it's simply just calculated what is the time it takes to 63% of your max velocity, right? So how fast do you accelerate? So if we go back to this one, we have our ratio of force, that's the 50.8. We have the DRF, the decrease ratio of force, that's the negative 7.15. We have our F0 and our V0 at the top. How to actually collect a force velocity profile is very simple. Pick a distance that is long enough to ensure that the athlete reaches max velocity. For most athletes, this is 30 yards. For some of your more elite athletes, right, high-level college football players, track sprinters, things like that, they might need 35. Some of your more developmental athletes, or let's say a football lineman, they might need only 25 yards, but 30 yards is a really good place to start. Something that is light on your 1080 sprint, 2 or 3 kilos is enough to not interfere with the athlete sprinting, but enough load for the motor to keep the line kind of stable and get really good data. And 1 to 2 reps. 2 just to make sure, and then you can just take the best rep of the 2. So the best practices in how to get consistent, repeatable, reliable force velocity profiles is be well rested in between your sprints. Again, we need to achieve the max velocity possible, or the truest representation of doing the task of sprinting as fast as possible. In general, the athlete should be prepared to sprint all out, right? When it's first day after 3 months of off season, might not make the most sense to say, hey, let's just go out and let it eat and see what happens, right? So there should be 1, 2, 3 weeks of just getting ready to sprint kind of all out, upright, 30 plus yards. And this is super, super important. This next one is having a snappy, sudden start. So the 1080 sprint starts collecting data when the athlete reaches 0.2 meters a second, or about 0.4 miles an hour, which is relatively slow, especially if the athlete is in a 2-point start, right? Versus 3-point is 1 hand down and 4-point is 2 hands down. It's really easy for the athlete to kind of roll into the start or kind of cheat. But because there are metrics that are calculated like very, very close to the beginning of the sprint, like RF max, F0 is near the beginning. If the sprint is triggered too early, right? If they kind of roll into it, that could affect some of the numbers. So make sure that the athlete is at a super standstill and they come out snappy, explosive, very sudden, and there's no kind of cheating or rolling going into it. Athletes should peak out. So basically at the end of the run when they reach their max velocity, and you can double check this on the graph, you should see that they do slow down a little bit at the end, right? So picking a distance is long enough to reach the max velocity, but not so much distance that they're just like wasting 5, 10, 15 yards of just already having reached their max velocity. So I call that peaking out, and the software will actually tell you if the athlete needs more distance, right? It'll say, quote, too short, because the dashed line that we saw earlier, it needs more data to kind of predict what that line would be to get a really good kind of force velocity profile. So make sure that the athlete peaks out. And last, a really good force velocity profile, the R squared, or how well that dashed line fits the actual run, should be above around 0.985. Again, the software will tell you that, but if you're doing all of the things that we talked about above this, that shouldn't be an issue as long as they have a snappy sudden start, they sprint all the way through the finish, and they don't fall down halfway through. So now what? You just got to do it. You have to collect a lot of data points, figure out what is high, what is low, what's good, what's bad, what matches your intuition, what doesn't match your intuition of all of the athletes that you train, and just learn which athletes do need 35 yards, which athletes can get away with just sprinting 25 yards for the force velocity profile. So hopefully just understanding what it is, how to execute it, will encourage you just to collect and then kind of just start your force velocity profiling journey. So any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out, 1080motion.com. We're on all social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn at 1080motion, and go make speed happen.